Edit, the funny thing about respect is that most people do not realize they are giving it to the wrong person until it is almost too late. The room fell silent the moment those words left Commander Harris's mouth. More than 30 operators stood inside the briefing hall, their attention fixed on the large screen at the front of the room. But no one was looking at the mission details anymore. Every eye had shifted toward a single person standing near the back wall. Emma Carter remained perfectly still. She had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. Around her, several members of the team exchanged glances. A few smirked. Others simply looked uncomfortable. Commander Harris paused before continuing. Some people earn respect through reputation. Some earn it through experience. And some earn it when everything is on the line. The statement sounded ordinary, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. Earlier that morning, Senior Operator Ryan Mitchell had openly questioned whether Emma belonged on the team. He had not raised his voice. He had not insulted her directly. In many ways, that made it worse. During a routine planning session, he had simply asked a question that hung in the air like a cloud nobody wanted to acknowledge. What happens when we discover standards were lowered for the sake of appearances? Nobody had answered him. Nobody needed to. The implication was clear. Emma was the only female SEAL assigned to the unit. For months, rumors had followed her through training centers, operational schools, and temporary assignments. Some people claimed she received special treatment. Others insisted she had been pushed forward to satisfy public expectations. Very few had ever taken the time to examine her actual record. The truth was less exciting than the rumors. Emma had simply worked harder than almost everyone around her. Yet facts rarely traveled as fast as assumptions. As the briefing ended, operators gathered their notes and filed toward the exit. Conversations immediately began around the room. Emma noticed how certain discussions stopped whenever she walked nearby. She noticed how people lowered their voices. She noticed the quick looks exchanged between teammates who believed she could not see them. None of it was new. None of it surprised her anymore. Outside, bright afternoon sunlight reflected off rows of vehicles parked across the base. The air carried the familiar smell of concrete warming under the summer sun. Emma adjusted the strap of her bag and headed toward the training facility. Behind her, footsteps approached. She already knew who it was before hearing his voice. Ryan Mitchell walked alongside her without making eye contact. "You should not take it personally," he said. Emma continued walking. "Take what personally?" Ryan shrugged. "People have questions." Emma nodded. "People always have questions." Ryan finally looked at her. "Then answer them." For a brief moment, Emma considered responding. She could have listed her qualifications. She could have pointed to years of evaluations. She could have reminded him that every requirement had been completed under the same standards everyone else faced. Instead, she simply said, "That is not how respect works." Ryan gave a small laugh. "Maybe." Then he walked away. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, but it stayed with Emma for the rest of the day. By evening, the entire base seemed to be buzzing with speculation. A major assignment was approaching. Details remained classified, but everyone knew selection decisions would be made soon. Every operator wanted a place on the team. Every operator wanted to prove their value. Emma sat alone in the dining facility reviewing training notes when two younger operators entered. They did not notice her immediately. "You think Mitchell is right?" one asked. The other shrugged. "I do not know. But if something important happens, who are you trusting?" Neither answered right away. Emma quietly closed H. The next morning began long before sunrise. A cool breeze moved across the base as operators gathered near the training complex, their boots striking the pavement in steady rhythm. Emma Carter arrived early as usual. She preferred the quiet hours before everyone else showed up. It was the only time the place felt free from judgment. She reviewed the schedule posted outside the building and immediately noticed something unusual. The upcoming team evaluation had been moved forward by 2 days. That meant every operator would have less time to prepare before leadership selected personnel for the assignment everyone had been discussing. Within minutes, the training area filled with conversations. Some operators complained about the schedule change. Others welcomed the challenge. Ryan Mitchell stood near a group of senior team members discussing possible scenarios. Emma listened from a distance. One thing became clear very quickly. Nobody expected her to make the final roster. Nobody said it directly, but assumptions rarely needed words. The morning exercise focused on planning and coordination. Commander Harris divided the operators into smaller groups and assigned each team a complex problem to solve under time pressure. Emma found herself assigned to Ryan's group. The reaction around the table was impossible to miss. A few operators exchanged looks. One quietly sighed. Another leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Ryan simply began organizing the discussion without acknowledging her presence. For the next 20 minutes, ideas moved around the table. Routes were suggested. Timelines were debated. Resources were allocated. Emma listened carefully. She noticed a flaw almost immediately. A critical assumption in the proposed plan depended on information that had never been verified. She waited for someone else to mention it. Nobody did. Finally, she spoke. What if the initial location estimate is wrong? The room became quiet for a moment. One operator glanced at Ryan before answering. It is not wrong. Emma remained calm. How do we know? No one had an immediate response. Ryan eventually pointed toward a document. Because that is what the briefing says. Emma nodded. The briefing says it is the most likely estimate, not a confirmed one. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ryan studied the document again. Technically, Emma was correct. The information had not been confirmed. Yet instead of exploring the issue, the discussion quickly moved on. The original plan remained unchanged. By lunchtime, the exercise ended. Later that afternoon, Commander Harris reviewed the results from every group. To everyone's surprise, he focused on the exact issue Emma had raised. The assumption regarding the location estimate had been intentionally inserted into the scenario as a test. Most teams missed it. Emma's group lost points because they ignored the uncertainty. A few operators looked toward her. Nobody apologized. Nobody acknowledged that she had identified the problem first. The moment passed as if it had never happened. Emma expected nothing different. After months with the unit, she understood the pattern. If she succeeded, people questioned the circumstances. If she pointed out a mistake, people ignored it until someone else confirmed it. Recognition always seemed to arrive with her name removed from the conversation. That evening, another training session took place on a large outdoor course. Teams rotated through a series of problem-solving stations requiring communication, timing, and attention to detail. Emma again found herself working alongside people who clearly preferred someone else in her position. At one station, the team struggled to complete a task within the required time limit. Frustration began spreading. Voices grew sharper. Operators rushed through instructions without listening to one another. Emma stepped back and watched the confusion unfold. Then she noticed something simple. Two team members were following different versions of the same instructions. The disagreement had nothing to do with skill. They were literally working from separate assumptions. Emma pointed it out. The misunderstanding disappeared almost immediately. The task was completed minutes later. One of the younger operators looked surprised. How did you catch that? Emma shrugged. I listened. The answer sounded simple, but it stayed with him. Across the course, Ryan had observed the interaction from a distance. He said nothing, but the expression on his face suggested uncertainty. For the first time, he appeared less confident in his earlier conclusions. Still, years of assumptions are not abandoned in a single afternoon. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, operators headed back toward the barracks. Conversations filled the walkways. Laughter echoed between buildings. Yet beneath the normal routine, subtle changes were beginning to occur. A few people who had never spoken to Emma before now nodded when passing her. Others seemed less certain about the rumors they had accepted as fact. The change was small, almost invisible, but it was there. Emma noticed it without allowing herself to become distracted by it. Respect gained too easily could disappear just as quickly. What mattered was consistency. What mattered was being ready when the moment arrived. Because somewhere beyond the gates of the base, a real mission was approaching, and Emma had a growing feeling that the challenges ahead would expose far more than anyone expected. 3 days before final selections were scheduled to be announced, the atmosphere across the base began to change. What had once felt like routine preparation now carried a sense of urgency. Operators arrived earlier, stayed later, and paid closer attention to every evaluation. Everyone understood that opportunities were limited. Every performance mattered. Every mistake was remembered. Emma Carter continued following the same approach she had adopted since arriving at the unit. She worked quietly, avoided unnecessary arguments, and focused on details that others often overlooked. Yet despite her consistency, she remained an outsider in many ways. People were becoming less dismissive, but acceptance was still far away. Early that morning, Commander Harris gathered several teams for an advanced planning exercise designed to test adaptability under pressure. The scenario evolved every few minutes, forcing participants to revise strategies as new information arrived. Most operators enjoyed these exercises because they rewarded experience and quick decision-making. Ryan Mitchell was known for excelling in exactly this type of environment. As the session began, Ryan immediately assumed leadership of his group. His confidence was understandable. Years of experience had earned him a reputation as one of the most capable operators in the unit. Team members naturally followed his lead. Emma listened carefully while notes and recommendations moved across the table. For nearly 30 minutes, everything appeared to be progressing smoothly. Then the scenario changed. New information created a conflict between the original objective and the available resources. The room became noticeably more tense. Operators debated priorities. Some wanted to continue following the original plan. Others argued for a complete revision. Ryan evaluated several options before choosing a path forward. The discussion continued, but Emma noticed a problem that nobody else seemed to recognize. Everyone was focused on the immediate challenge. Nobody was considering how the latest change would affect events several hours later. She reviewed the information twice before speaking. If we continue with this approach, we create a bottleneck later in the timeline. Several heads turned toward her. One operator frowned. What bottleneck? Emma pointed toward a series of projected resource requirements. The schedule works now, but not after the second phase. We are solving one problem and creating another. Ryan studied the numbers. At first he appeared unconvinced. Then he quietly recalculated part of the timeline himself. His expression changed slightly. Emma was right. The issue would not appear immediately, but it would eventually create a serious complication. For a moment the room was silent. Then Ryan adjusted the plan. Nobody acknowledged where the correction came from. The meeting continued as if the observation had appeared on its own. Emma expected nothing else. Later that afternoon, evaluation scores from recent exercises were posted internally for leadership review. Most operators never saw the full reports, but word traveled quickly. Emma had quietly ranked near the top in several categories, including analysis, decision support, and situational awareness. The information surprised many people. Some dismissed it as an anomaly. Others searched for explanations that would fit their existing assumptions. A few operators simply accepted the results. Among them was a young team member named Tyler Brooks. Unlike many others, Tyler had arrived at the unit recently and carried fewer preconceptions. During an evening equipment check, he approached Emma with a question. "Can I ask you something?" Emma looked up from her work. "Sure." Tyler hesitated. "How do you keep doing it?" She smiled slightly. "Doing what?" "Showing up every day like none of this bothers you." Emma considered the question. "Who says it does not bother me?" Tyler looked surprised. Emma continued. "The difference is that I do not let it decide how I work." Tyler nodded slowly. The answer stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Across the base, Ryan was dealing with questions of his own. He had spent months believing he understood Emma. In his mind, she represented a decision made by people outside the unit. Someone placed there to satisfy expectations rather than meet them. Yet recent weeks had introduced uncomfortable contradictions. She consistently identified problems before others. She remained calm when criticized. She never sought attention when she was proven right. None of that matched the narrative he had built in his head. For the first time, Ryan found himself paying closer attention. The next morning, another assessment took place. This one focused on observation and information processing. Participants were required to analyze a rapidly changing situation and identify hidden patterns. When the results were reviewed, Emma finished first. Not by a small margin, but by a significant one. The room reacted with visible surprise. Some operators exchanged confused looks. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Ryan said nothing. Commander Harris, however, seemed unsurprised. As the group prepared to leave, the commander offered a brief comment. "Interesting how often people reveal themselves when others finally start paying attention." The statement lingered in the room long after he walked away. Emma returned to her duties without celebration. She understood something that many others did not. Recognition was beginning to grow, but respect had not yet arrived. And somewhere just beyond the horizon, a challenge was approaching that would test every assumption the unit still held about her. The official roster announcement was scheduled for the following afternoon, but by sunrise the entire base already felt different. Conversations stopped when leaders entered rooms. Operators checked their messages more often than usual. Every person assigned to the unit understood that careers could change based on what happened next. Emma Carter approached the day like every other. She arrived early, reviewed schedules, and focused on the work directly in front of her. The growing tension around the base did not distract her. Experience had taught her that anticipation rarely improved performance. Results did. Shortly after breakfast, Commander Harris called several senior operators into a planning room for a final readiness review. To Emma's surprise, her name appeared on the attendance list. As she entered the room, she immediately noticed the reaction from several people already seated around the table. Some looked surprised. Others looked annoyed. Ryan Mitchell sat near the center of the room, studying a collection of briefing materials. He glanced up briefly before returning his attention to the documents. Commander Harris began the meeting without wasting time. The upcoming assignment, while still confidential, would require extensive preparation, adaptability, and precise decision-making. The purpose of the meeting was not to reveal details, but to evaluate how potential team members approached complex situations. Over the next hour, leadership presented a series of evolving scenarios. Most participants focused on immediate solutions. Emma focused on identifying patterns. During one discussion, she noticed that several proposed plans relied heavily on assumptions carried over from earlier information. The problem was that new information had already made those assumptions questionable. Emma pointed it out carefully. At first, the room resisted the observation. Then Commander Harris asked everyone to review the data again. Within minutes, it became clear that Emma had identified another issue before anyone else. The correction significantly improved the proposed approach. Nobody openly challenged her this time. That alone represented progress. Yet something else caught Emma's attention. Ryan did not appear frustrated. He appeared thoughtful. It was a subtle difference, but an important one. Later that day, operators gathered for a final field evaluation. The exercise required teams to process information quickly while adapting to changing conditions. Unlike previous assessments, this one forced participants to work with people they did not normally choose as partners. Emma was assigned to Ryan's group once again. Several operators exchanged uncertain looks when the teams were announced. The exercise began smoothly. Team members moved through each stage efficiently, communicating well and staying organized. Then an unexpected change was introduced midway through the evaluation. Information that everyone had relied on suddenly became unreliable. Confusion spread almost immediately. Some operators wanted to continue with the original plan. Others argued for starting over entirely. Valuable time disappeared as the debate continued. Emma stepped back and observed the discussion. Something about the situation felt familiar. After reviewing the available information, she realized the group was focused on solving the wrong problem. Everyone was trying to restore certainty when certainty no longer existed. The real challenge was operating effectively despite uncertainty. She explained her reasoning. Several people hesitated. Then something unexpected happened. Ryan listened. Not reluctantly. Not out of obligation. He listened because he genuinely wanted to understand her perspective. After a brief discussion, he nodded. Try it. The room became quiet. It was the first time many operators had ever seen Ryan openly support one of Emma's recommendations. The adjustment worked. The team regained momentum and completed the evaluation successfully. As participants packed equipment and prepared to leave, conversations immediately began spreading across the training area. People noticed what had happened. More importantly, they noticed who had made it happen. For months, many operators had viewed Emma through the lens of rumors and assumptions. Now those assumptions were becoming harder to defend. That evening, the base buzzed with speculation regarding the final roster. Some believed experience would remain the deciding factor. Others argued that recent evaluations had changed everything. Emma ignored the discussions. She spent the evening reviewing notes and preparing for whatever came next. Shortly before sunset, she crossed paths with Tyler Brooks near the barracks. "You know people are talking about you, right?" he asked. Emma smiled faintly. "People have been talking about me since I arrived." Tyler laughed. "This is different." Emma looked toward the distant training grounds where long shadows stretched across the pavement. Maybe he was right. Something was changing. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. For the first time, Some members of the unit were beginning to judge her based on what she actually did rather than what they assumed she represented. Yet Emma also understood that real acceptance had not arrived. One successful recommendation would not erase months of doubt. One strong evaluation would not change every opinion. The true test still lay ahead. As darkness settled over the base, a notification appeared on operators' secure devices. Final team selections would be announced at 8 o'clock the next morning. Across the installation, anticipation reached its highest point. Some operators felt confident. Others felt nervous. Emma felt neither. She simply looked at the message, locked her screen, and continued preparing. Because whether she made the team or not, she knew something that most people still did not. The assignment everyone was waiting for would challenge the unit in ways no training exercise ever could. And when that moment arrived, hidden assumptions would matter far less than genuine capability. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, operators gathered inside the main briefing hall. The atmosphere felt heavier than usual. Nobody spoke much while waiting for the roster announcement. Every person in the room understood what was at stake. Commander Harris entered carrying a tablet and a folder. Without ceremony, he began reading names. One after another, selected operators were assigned to the upcoming mission team. Some names generated quiet nods of approval. Others caused visible surprise. Emma Carter stood near the back of the room, listening carefully while keeping her expression neutral. Then her name was called. For a brief moment, silence settled across the room. Several operators exchanged glances. A few seemed genuinely shocked. Tyler Brooks smiled immediately. Ryan Mitchell remained still, showing little reaction, but Emma noticed something different this time. There was no frustration in his expression, no skepticism, only acceptance. The announcement continued until the final roster was complete. Once the meeting ended, selected personnel received instructions to report for mission preparation. The assignment remained confidential, but one thing became clear very quickly. The operation would be more complex than anyone expected. Throughout the next several days, the team participated in intensive planning sessions. Information arrived from multiple sources. Timelines shifted. Objectives evolved. Every briefing seemed to introduce new variables. Instead of becoming simpler, the situation grew increasingly complicated. Emma spent long hours reviewing reports and identifying connections between pieces of information that initially appeared unrelated. During one planning session, she noticed several inconsistencies between separate intelligence summaries. At first they seemed minor. Different reporting times, slightly different descriptions, small details most people ignored. Yet the more she examined them, the more concerned she became. Late one afternoon, she approached Ryan after a briefing. "Can I show you something?" Ryan looked up from a stack of documents. "Sure." Emma placed several reports on the table and pointed toward specific sections. "These details do not match." Ryan studied the pages. "Could be reporting errors." "Maybe," Emma replied. "But there are too many of them." Ryan continued reviewing the information. The inconsistencies were subtle, but they existed. "What do you think it means?" he asked. Emma hesitated. "I think we are looking at an incomplete picture." Ryan leaned back in his chair. "That is a serious conclusion." "I know." For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Ryan nodded. "Bring it up during tomorrow's review." Emma thanked him and left. The following morning, she presented her concerns to the planning team. The response was mixed. Some people listened carefully. Others remained unconvinced. Several believed the discrepancies were insignificant. One senior analyst argued that such differences appeared in reports all the time. The discussion ended without a clear resolution. Officially, nothing changed. Unofficially, doubt had entered the room. As preparations continued, additional challenges emerged. Equipment schedules shifted unexpectedly. Transportation timelines required adjustment. Communication procedures had to be revised more than once. Individually, none of the issues seemed critical. Together, however, they created growing uncertainty. Emma could feel it. So could everyone else. What had originally appeared to be a straightforward operation was becoming increasingly unpredictable. One evening, after a particularly long planning session, several team members gathered in a conference room to review final preparations. Fatigue was beginning to affect everyone. Conversations became shorter. Patience became thinner. During the review, another discrepancy surfaced. Then another. The room grew noticeably tense. Ryan stood at the front reviewing updates while operators searched for explanations. Eventually, someone asked the question everyone had been thinking. How did we miss this many problems? No one answered immediately. Then Ryan surprised the room. Maybe we did not miss them. Several people looked toward him. Ryan continued. Emma raised concerns about the information days ago. The statement hung in the air. Nobody argued. Nobody challenged it. For the first time, Ryan publicly acknowledged her observation in front of the team. Emma remained silent, but she noticed the reaction around the room. People were paying attention now, not because of who she was, but because her concerns were proving difficult to ignore. Later that night, as the base settled into relative quiet, updated information finally arrived from higher headquarters. The new reports confirmed what Emma had suspected. Several assumptions used throughout the planning process were incomplete. Certain details required immediate revision. The mission itself remained active, but the foundation beneath the original plan had shifted significantly. Operators were called back for an emergency review meeting. The atmosphere inside the room felt completely different from previous briefings. Confidence had been replaced by caution. Predictability had been replaced by uncertainty. Commander Harris addressed the team directly. Everything changes from this point forward. We adapt or we fail. No one disagreed. As the meeting concluded, Emma looked around the room. The assignment was no longer a distant objective discussed in briefing slides and planning documents. It had become real. More importantly, the challenges ahead were beginning to expose weaknesses that training exercises could never fully replicate. And as the team prepared for the next phase, Emma could not shake a growing feeling that the most difficult decisions were still waiting just beyond the horizon. The emergency review meeting stretched late into the night. Screens filled with revised timelines, updated reports, and newly discovered gaps in information. What had once seemed manageable now felt increasingly fragile. Every adjustment solved one problem while creating another. The team remained focused, but fatigue was beginning to show. Operators reread documents they had already studied twice. Analysts double-checked information that should have been settled days earlier. Yet the more everyone searched for certainty, the harder it became to find. Emma Carter sat quietly near the end of the conference table, reviewing the latest updates. Something continued bothering her. The inconsistencies identified earlier had been addressed, but the overall picture still did not make sense. Pieces fit together individually. Together, they formed something incomplete. Across the room, Ryan Mitchell was leading a discussion regarding contingency plans. Several operators proposed alternatives. Others debated priorities. The conversation moved in circles for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, Commander Harris interrupted. We are discussing solutions before we fully understand the problem. The room fell silent. It was an uncomfortable observation because it was true. Emma looked back at the information displayed on the screen. Then she noticed something she had not considered before. A small detail buried inside one of the revised reports connected directly to a scheduling change that had occurred days earlier. On its own, the detail seemed insignificant. Combined with everything else, however, it suggested an entirely different interpretation. Emma reviewed the information again, then a third time. The more she examined it, the more convinced she became. She raised her hand slightly. Several people looked toward her. I think we are asking the wrong question. One operator frowned. What do you mean? Emma stood and walked toward the display. We keep assuming these inconsistencies are separate problems. What if they are connected? She pointed towards several updates spread across different sections of the briefing. This change affects this timeline. That timeline affects this resource allocation. And that allocation explains why the reporting gaps appeared in the first place. The room grew quiet. Ryan studied the information carefully. You think there is a single cause? Emma nodded. I think we have been treating symptoms instead of identifying the source. Several analysts immediately began reviewing her logic. At first, responses were skeptical. Then questions turned into discussions. Discussions turned into calculations. Within minutes, people started recognizing connections they had previously missed. The emerging picture was not perfect, but it explained far more than the existing assumptions. Even so, not everyone agreed. One senior planner shook his head. There is not enough evidence. Another analyst nodded in agreement. It is an interesting theory, but we cannot restructure everything based on speculation. Emma expected resistance. She remained calm. Then test it. The room fell silent again. It was a simple answer, but an important one. Rather than arguing, she invited verification. Commander Harris looked toward the analysts. Can we test it? One of them nodded slowly. Yes. It will take a few hours. Harris checked the time. Then start now. The meeting temporarily adjourned while teams worked through the night. Emma returned to her desk and continued reviewing information. Around midnight, Ryan approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside her. You might need this. Emma smiled. Thanks. Ryan sat down across from her. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, he leaned back and crossed his arms. You know, most people still are not convinced. Emma nodded. I know. And you are still willing to stand behind your assessment? Yes. Ryan studied her expression. Why? Emma considered the question carefully. Because I am not attached to being right. I am attached to finding the truth. If the evidence proves me wrong tomorrow, I will accept it. Ryan looked away for a moment before quietly nodding. There was something different in his demeanor now. The skepticism that once defined every conversation between them was fading. In its place was respect, though neither of them acknowledged it directly. Hours later, just before sunrise, the analysts completed their review. Team members gathered once again inside the briefing room. Exhaustion filled the air. Commander Harris entered carrying a fresh report. Without saying a word, he handed copies to the leadership team. The room remained silent while they reviewed the findings. Then one analyst finally spoke. Her assessment was correct. A wave of quiet surprise moved through the room. The report confirmed that multiple problems previously treated as separate issues shared a common source. More importantly, identifying that connection provided a clearer path forward. For several seconds, nobody said anything. Then Ryan looked directly at Emma. In front of the entire room, he gave a small nod. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. Yet everyone understood its significance. For the first time since Emma arrived at the unit, one of the most respected operators on the team had openly acknowledged her judgment. And although the mission itself remained uncertain, something else had changed forever. The voice that many people once ignored had become the voice they could no longer afford to overlook. By the time the sun rose over the base that morning, the atmosphere had changed in a way that everyone could feel, but few could describe. The team was no longer arguing about whether Emma Carter belonged. The conversation had shifted to something far more important. What came next? The latest discoveries had forced leadership to revise major portions of the operation plan. Timelines were updated. Responsibilities were reassigned. New contingencies were added. The mission had become more demanding, and every operator understood that mistakes would be costly. Inside the primary briefing room, Commander Harris stood before a large display, reviewing the latest updates. Team members listened carefully while taking notes. Unlike previous meetings, interruptions were rare. People had become more cautious about dismissing information too quickly. Several times during the briefing, operators looked toward Emma whenever a complicated issue appeared on the screen. She noticed it, but said nothing. Recognition was useful only when it improved decision-making. Seeking attention had never been her goal. Midway through the meeting, another challenge emerged. New information created a conflict between 2 critical planning priorities. The team could pursue one objective with greater efficiency, or they could preserve greater flexibility for unexpected changes later. Unfortunately, they could not maximize both. The room immediately divided into competing opinions. Some favored efficiency. Others favored flexibility. The debate continued for nearly half an hour. Every argument seemed reasonable. Every solution created new problems. Eventually, all eyes turned toward Ryan Mitchell. For years, he had been one of the most trusted decision-makers in the unit. His judgment carried weight. Yet this time Ryan hesitated. Not because he lacked experience, but because he understood the situation was more complicated than it appeared. He studied the information for several moments before looking across the room. Then he did something nobody would have expected a few weeks earlier. Emma, he said, what are we missing? The question changed the atmosphere instantly. Several operators looked surprised. Others simply waited for her answer. Emma reviewed the display carefully. She did not rush. She did not treat the question as an opportunity to prove herself. After a minute of consideration, she stood and approached the screen. I think both sides are solving the problem from the same assumption. One operator frowned. Which assumption? Emma pointed toward the projected timeline. That this schedule has to remain fixed. The room became quiet. She continued. We keep debating how to work within the existing framework. What if the framework itself is the problem? Several people exchanged glances. Emma began outlining an alternative approach. Instead of choosing between efficiency and flexibility, she proposed restructuring portions of the timeline to create room for both. It required adjustments. It required coordination. Most importantly, it required people to abandon ideas they had already become attached to. Initial reactions were mixed. Some operators immediately saw the advantages. Others remained skeptical. One planner argued that the changes would create unnecessary complexity. Emma listened carefully before responding. The complexity already exists. We are just pretending it does not. Nobody answered right away. Ryan studied the proposal. Then he asked a series of detailed questions. Emma answered each one calmly. The discussion continued for nearly 40 minutes. Slowly, resistance began to fade. Not because Emma argued louder than everyone else, but because her reasoning continued holding up under scrutiny. Eventually, Commander Harris looked around the room. Can anyone identify a better alternative? Silence followed. Harris nodded once. Then we moved forward. The decision marked an important turning point. For the first time, a major operational adjustment had been built around Emma's recommendation. More importantly, the team accepted it because they believed in the idea, not because they felt obligated to support her. Later that afternoon, preparations accelerated. Teams coordinated revised schedules. Analysts updated planning documents. Communication channels remained active almost nonstop. Amid the activity, Ryan found Emma reviewing final updates near the operations center. You know, he said, a few months ago, I would have fought that recommendation for an hour. Emma smiled slightly. I know. Ryan laughed quietly. The worst part is that I probably would have been wrong. Emma looked at him. Most people are wrong about something. The important part is what happens afterward. Ryan considered the answer. For a moment, he seemed ready to say more, but a notification interrupted the conversation. Both checked their devices. New information had arrived. The mission timeline was moving forward sooner than expected. Activity immediately increased across the base. Operators gathered equipment. Leaders coordinated final reviews. Preparation was giving way to execution. As Emma looked around the busy operations center, she noticed something she never expected to see. People were no longer questioning whether she belonged there. They were seeking her perspective. Yet despite the growing respect around her, Emma could not ignore a feeling deep in the back of her mind. The hardest challenge had not happened yet. Every obstacle so far had existed inside briefing rooms, planning sessions, and training environments. Soon the team would face situations that no amount of preparation could fully predict. And when that moment arrived, trust would become more important than expertise, more important than reputation, and more important than anything anyone had believed when this journey first began. The following days moved faster than anyone expected. The operation entered its most demanding phase, and the pressure on every member of the team increased dramatically. Plans that had seemed solid only a week earlier now required constant adjustment. New information arrived at unpredictable intervals. Timelines shifted. Priorities changed. What separated successful teams from unsuccessful ones was no longer preparation alone. It was the ability to adapt without losing focus. Emma Carter found herself at the center of more discussions than ever before. Not because she demanded attention, but because people had started noticing a pattern. Whenever confusion emerged, she often identified the underlying issue before anyone else. Whenever competing opinions created deadlock, she usually found a path forward that others had overlooked. Yet despite the growing confidence around her, Emma remained cautious. She understood how quickly circumstances could change. One afternoon, the team gathered for what was expected to be the final comprehensive review before execution. The room was filled with senior personnel, analysts, planners, and operators. Large displays covered the walls, showing schedules, coordination plans, and contingency options. Commander Harris opened the session by reviewing the latest updates. Everything appeared to be progressing according to plan until an unexpected report arrived halfway through the briefing. The information immediately created concern throughout the room. A key assumption supporting several important decisions was suddenly in question. Conversations erupted almost instantly. Analysts debated interpretations. Planners argued over possible responses. Operators searched for practical solutions. The more people discussed the problem, the more complicated it appeared. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. Despite everyone's efforts, no clear answer emerged. The room felt trapped between competing choices, each carrying significant disadvantages. Emma listened carefully. She reviewed every update, every report, and every recommendation being discussed. Gradually, she realized something important. Everyone was focused on protecting the existing plan. Very few people were questioning whether the plan itself still deserved protection. She waited until a pause appeared in the discussion. Then she spoke. What if the safest option is not preserving the original structure? The room quieted. Several people turned toward her immediately. Emma stood and walked toward the display. She pointed to several sections of the planning timeline. We keep treating this update as a threat to our strategy. What if it is actually showing us a better one? An analyst frowned. Explain. Emma carefully outlined her reasoning. Instead of forcing new information into an outdated framework, she proposed reorganizing priorities entirely. The recommendation was bold. It required abandoning weeks of assumptions. It required accepting that some previous decisions had been based on incomplete understanding. Most importantly, it required trust. As she continued explaining the concept, the room became increasingly attentive. Questions followed. Emma answered each one methodically. Some challenges were difficult. Others revealed weaknesses in the proposal. Yet every time a flaw appeared, she adjusted the approach without becoming defensive. The discussion evolved from skepticism into collaboration. Even those who initially disagreed found themselves engaging seriously with the idea. Ryan Mitchell watched the entire exchange closely. Months earlier, he would have challenged every assumption she presented. Now he found himself doing something very different. He was evaluating the merits of the idea rather than the identity of the person presenting it. Eventually, Commander Harris looked around the room. Does anyone have a stronger alternative? Nobody answered. The silence lasted several seconds. Then Ryan spoke. No, I think she is right. The statement carried enormous weight. Not because Ryan was the highest-ranking person in the room, but because everyone knew his history. Everyone remembered his doubts. Everyone remembered his criticism. Hearing those words from him changed the atmosphere instantly. The recommendation was approved. Teams immediately began implementing the revised approach. What followed surprised even some of Emma's strongest supporters. As updates were incorporated and schedules adjusted, multiple problems that had seemed unrelated began resolving themselves. Conflicts disappeared. Coordination improved. Bottlenecks vanished. The new structure created clarity where confusion had previously existed. Operators who had spent days struggling with uncertainty suddenly found themselves working from a far more effective framework. By evening, the operations center felt completely different. Energy replaced frustration. Confidence replaced doubt. The mission still carried challenges, but the team finally felt aligned. As people moved through the room reviewing final preparations, Emma noticed something she had never experienced since joining the unit. Team members were not merely accepting her presence. They were relying on her judgment. Some asked for her opinion directly. Others included her in discussions automatically. The change had happened gradually, but now it was impossible to ignore. Later that night, Ryan approached her while reviewing the final updates. He looked around the room before speaking. You know what is strange? Emma glanced up. What? Ryan smiled slightly. Months ago, most people thought you were the biggest question mark on this team. Emma laughed quietly. And now? Ryan looked toward the operators working confidently throughout the room. Now I think you are the reason we stopped asking the wrong questions. For a moment, neither spoke. Then both returned to work. Because although respect had finally arrived, the story was not over yet. The mission still awaited, and the most meaningful recognition would not come from words spoken inside a briefing room. It would come from what people chose to remember after everything was finished. Edit several weeks later, the operation was complete. The long hours of preparation, the endless revisions, the difficult decisions, and the uncertainty that had followed the team for so long were finally behind them. Back at the base, life slowly began returning to normal. Training schedules resumed. Routine meetings returned to the calendar. The constant pressure that had dominated every day gradually faded. Yet despite the return of normal routines, something had changed permanently within the unit. On a quiet afternoon, operators gathered inside the same briefing hall where months earlier Emma Carter had stood as the person almost nobody trusted. The room looked exactly the same. The walls had not changed. The chairs had not moved. The large display screens still covered the front of the room. Yet the atmosphere felt completely different. Commander Harris stood before the group and reviewed lessons learned from the operation. Various team members received recognition for contributions made throughout the planning and execution process. Several names were mentioned for leadership. Others were acknowledged for adaptability, preparation, or teamwork. Emma listened quietly from her seat, expecting nothing more than another routine review. Recognition had never been the reason she showed up every day. She had learned long ago that chasing approval usually led to disappointment. What mattered was doing the work correctly. As the meeting continued, Commander Harris eventually paused and looked around the room. "Before we finish," he said, "there is something that deserves to be addressed." The room became quiet. Harris folded his hands behind his back. One of the biggest lessons from this operation has nothing to do with planning, logistics, or preparation. Several operators exchanged curious looks. Harris continued, "It has to do with assumptions." Nobody spoke. The commander slowly walked across the front of the room. "We spend years developing instincts. Most of the time, those instincts help us. Sometimes they protect us from mistakes. But every once in a while, they convince us that we already know the answer before we understand the question." The room remained silent. Everyone knew where the conversation was heading. Harris finally looked directly toward Emma. There were multiple moments during this process when important decisions improved because one person saw what the rest of us missed. Emma immediately felt attention shift toward her from every direction. She remained still. Harris nodded once. And if we are being honest, many people in this room were too busy judging the source of those ideas to properly evaluate their value. No one argued. No one looked away. The statement was true. For months, assumptions had influenced almost every interaction. Yet now those assumptions seemed impossible to defend. After Harris finished speaking, he returned to his seat. The room remained quiet for several seconds. Then something unexpected happened. Ryan Mitchell stood up. Several people looked surprised. Ryan was not known for making emotional speeches. He preferred direct action over public statements. Yet he remained standing. His eyes moved across the room before finally settling on Emma. "I owe someone an